doing was an acceptance test on a website. And we had a legacy system, because the website was being built to be a clone of an existing system, and it was basically to work like the existing system except when it wasn't. And that was pretty well specified as to what the few minor changes were. So we had a legacy system. So we had a reliable test oracle that we could refer to. We had a very experienced tester who, in fact, had been involved in testing the legacy system, the legacy website. So he already knew what this thing was to do from previous testing. And we also were, reasonably confident that we could do this, without a whole lot of upfront analysis. That the point of the website and its capabilities and features and risks and so forth would be immediately obvious to this tester who was very experienced. And he was able to test successfully, and we were pleased with the results of that. So I think that was a case where, a blended strategy where if we spend a lot of time on doing a risk analysis and a lot of time trying to put automation in place and so forth, that would have been a disaster. That would have been a waste of time, because there was nothing in there to indicate that the purely reactive approach by itself would not work. Now, that said, I think that is an outlier. I think that is an unusual situation, that more often than not, a blended approach is something that you want to have. And so, I gave the example of trying to use a purely automated approach as a disaster, using myself as my own example of failure there, if you will, of trying to automate all of those compatibility tests for the database query tool, focusing on that and missing out on other important quality risks. Now, if we used a blended approach there where we'd had some sort of risk analysis and tried to figure out, okay, what are the important areas of this product and which of those tests can be covered with automated tests, which of those tests need to be covered with manual tests, and then we'd done that, and then we'd thrown into the balance also some reactive testing to try to balance that out, I think that would have been quite effective there. So, that was a case where failing to blend was a problem. So blended is better most of the time, and it's up to you to figure out whether, well, for one thing, what blend of what strategies, and for another thing, is this one of those unusual cases where actually a single test strategy is the right thing to go. Now we have a question from my buddy Lee Copeland. Lee, how are you? And by the way, it was Deming, not Box, who said that all models are wrong and some are useful. Anyway, if those of you who know Lee and I know that that's sort of a long-running joke between us. Anyway, Lee asks, I recently saw a movie called A Day Without a Mexican, which I've seen too, and which is absolutely a great movie, in which all people of Hispanic descent simply vanish in one day. And as I remember, Lee, the entire state of California, or at least Southern California, it comes to a screeching halt when that occurs. It's equivalent to your idea of a release without testing. I've been promoting it for years, but with no takers. Glad you're promoting it too. I wonder why no one listens to us. Yeah, that's a good point, Lee. I mean, I was being somewhat facetious in my comment about, just try shipping an untested product sometime and see what happens. But I mean, it really it would be sort of the ultimate test, and I think that in a lot of organizations, they actually, if they were dared to do it, they would back down. I don't think as Lee says, wonder why no one listens, or why we don't have any takers. Well, because I think that ultimately, when you dare people to take that risk, they sort of start staring into the abyss and say, ooh, that's bad. But still, we need to have more to offer, I think, than just fear, uncertainty, and doubt, too. Though that's certainly part of the sales pitch for testing as it goes, is telling people, well, any number of bad things could happen if you release this with insufficient testing. The problem with fear, uncertainty, and doubt as a sales tool is I think that's often connected to a lot of buyer's remorse. You feel like you got guilt-tripped into something, and then there's some resentment. So I really say, yeah, sure, we should talk about risks and talk about the bad things that can happen if we're not there, but let's also make sure that we've got a positive message about how much money we're saving the organization and the confidence that we're providing and so forth, and be able to say, without us it'd be bad, but with us it's really good. So thank you for that opportunity to bloviate further there on that one. Lee now replies, it was Box. Okay, let's see. We got another question via email here. Email question: how does the assessment process typically work? I want to avoid getting off into too much of a big spiel on this. I did talk about this in an earlier webinar. Briefly, the assessment process is you do some prep work, which would involve looking at data and looking at documents and so forth, and then coming to some initial conclusions. And then, there'd be an on-site portion of the work where you're doing the interviews and you're doing a lot more data analysis and all of that good stuff. And then there's a report preparation and delivery piece that typically is going to result in a PowerPoint presentation and typically a written report, anywhere 50 to 100 pages long, depending on the scope of the assessment. And usually this is about a month from the beginning of the engagement to the end, and being delivery of the report. That can change if you've got a lot of different sites to be looked at, but if it's one site, it's usually about a month, and this is about 2 weeks of work, and about 1 week of which is on site. Okay, I got a question from Tony here. Can you suggest where an organization might start a metrics gathering program to gather some of this information? Well, Tony, I recently contributed a chapter to a book that's going to be coming out called Beautiful Testing. And this is part of the sort of an O'Reilly series. It should be out, I think, by the end of the year. And by the series, by the way, the authors don't get any money from that. There's no royalties. It all gets donated to a charity, in this case called Nothing But Nets, which buys malaria nets. So in that chapter that I contributed to the book, my chapter was entitled Beautiful Testing Satisfies Stakeholders. And what I did in that chapter is fairly brief. It was like 10 pages or 11 pages long. I went through and tried to identify some of the important stakeholders that you might have in your testing, and then what would be seen as successful testing for them, and then some metrics that I would say would allow you to measure whether you were testing successfully from their point of view and so forth. So that's I think the basic process that I would suggest is that you say, okay, testing exists to provide important services to various stakeholders in the testing process. So I identify who those stakeholders are, and then I have to identify what it is that they want. What are their objectives? And then based on that, I need to start thinking about, what are the questions that I need to be able to answer to be able to say, did we or did we not meet these objectives? And then based on that, I can define metrics. Typically, the metrics are going to look at questions like, how effective is the organization at doing this? How efficient is the organization at doing this? How satisfied are the stakeholders with the way that the test organization is doing it? Those kinds of things. And if you go through that process, I think you can get a fairly good set of external metrics. And when I say external metrics, I mean those metrics that reflect your team's success as viewed by the external stakeholders. And there are also, of course, internal metrics that have to do with the tactical stuff you do day to day in order to deliver the things of value to the broader organization. And you need to also then look at that. And that gets to things like what percentage of tests are automated, for example. So, these are obviously part of our assessment process, is trying to help the organization put a metrics